Grazie. Thank you and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, dear Tram friends. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. I'm glad to welcome you to another appointment in this cycle of international video conferences dedicated to tramways and other means of transport. Today's presentation will be made by Tony Schill from the USA. Actually, it's the second part of a big presentation on the Pittsburgh streetcar system. This presentation will be done in English. At the end of the evening, there will be a space for any questions in English or in Italian, and you can also use the chat in every moment during this presentation. The complete program of the forthcoming presentation is available on our internet site, and the next one is scheduled for Tuesday, December 17th, and it will come from the USA too, dealing with the Seashore Trolley Museum, Maine. Thank you. And before giving the floor to Tony Schill, I have to repeat everything in Italian. Cari amici, signore e signori, buonasera, benvenuti alla una nuova serata di presentazione in questo ciclo di videoconferenze internazionali dedicate ai tram e agli altri mezzi di trasporto. La presentazione di questa sera viene dagli Stati Uniti d'America, sarà fatta da Tony Schill, ed è la seconda parte di una grande presentazione che riguarda il sistema tranviario di Pittsburgh. La presentazione sarà fatta in inglese. Alla fine della serata ci sarà spazio per domande, sia in inglese sia in italiano, ma potete usare anche la chat in ogni momento durante la presentazione. Il programma completo delle prossime presentazioni è disponibile sul nostro sito internet e vi ricordo che la prossima è programmato per martedì 17 dicembre e sarà fatta anche questa dagli Stati Uniti e riguarderà il Seashore Trolley Museum del Maine, che è il più grande museo tranviario del mondo. Grazie, la parola va ora a Tony Schill. Tony, it's up to you. The floor goes now to you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, very well.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you, Roberto, and thanks for inviting me back. I really enjoy giving these programs. Let's see. Some months back, I gave part one, which covered the Pittsburgh streetcar operation from inception in the 1880s to 1964. And in 1964, the Pittsburgh Railways Company was taken over, as were all the independent bus lines in Pittsburgh, by the Port Authority of Allegheny County, a governmental creation that was charged with preserving what was left of the transportation network in Pittsburgh. So I'm going to now push a button, and ideally, yeah, how about that? So Pittsburgh was founded in 1816. We're not going to talk about anything that far back. This sign has disappeared in recent years, as has the streetcar behind it. But for many years, it was very difficult to go anywhere in Pittsburgh or the surrounding suburbs without encountering streetcar tracks. But in 1955, things were not well. After World War II, and you'll see this on a graph in a minute, the use of public transit went into a nosedive starting about 1948. 1948 happened to be the peak year for transit in Pittsburgh in terms of ridership, and it went all downhill from there. Why? Increasing traffic congestion, automobiles, a nearly totally dysfunctional arrangement whereby Pittsburgh Railways was operating alongside 30-some bus operators, and there was no transfers, no route coordination, no schedule coordination, fares, or anything. The transit systems in Pittsburgh, not just Pittsburgh Railways, had about 450 buses and 650 PCC cars built 1936, 1949. There was a desire for true rapid transit. It came up many times and not a whole lot was done about it. What was felt by the municipal leaders and a lot of people with their cars that streetcars were obsolete and should be replaced. This is the situation for the Pittsburgh Railways Company. It was concentrated in the area in red on the map to the left. but had some substantial operations in the Orange area as well. City of Pittsburgh comprised about half the population of Allegheny County from 1920 up to about 1940. And after that, the suburban areas started to grow at a fast rate. And by 1950, the population had stabilized in the city itself and then started downward. So you can see there how the city became less important relative to the county. Naturally, Pittsburgh Railways was principally operating in the city. So if you go on the right, you can see the peak year, 1948, and how revenue ridership dropped off leading up to 1960. In order to, quote, save transit, end quote, the Port Authority came along. This is Pittsburgh Railways in 1950, just the streetcar lines. At that time, there was relatively little bus service. They had lines all the way down on the interurban, 35 miles from Pittsburgh on the south, and a very dense network within the city. In 1950, Pittsburgh Railways had been bankrupt since before World War II, but it remained in possession of the system and operated it as best they could. Finally, in 1951, it was reorganized as a new company, got rid of a lot of the underlying financial strictures that caused it to go bankrupt in the first place. But as part of the reorganization, there was a substantial reduction in streetcar service. The biggest was down at the bottom where the very long lines, much longer than they show on this map, the interurban lines were abandoned since they were the principal contributors to the operating deficit. Also, a long line up at middle left went out to Emsworth. And then the red lines, shaded red, were all streetcar lines which used double end cars and were short shuttle operations that were hopelessly uneconomic, and most of them were replaced by bus lines. But the Port Authority well, let's talk about the bus system. Pittsburgh Railways was primarily a streetcar system, but it used buses on three types of routes. First, the little feeder bus on top, which just had short lines or short shuttles that replaced streetcars. A premium bus service that dated back to the 1920s using highway coaches at a premium fare, even along streetcar lines. But because of the fare differential, which was pretty substantial back then, it really did not suck riders from the railroad trolley lines. Later, it was held to be illegal to have such a differential, and it was reduced to 5 cents, and conventional transit buses were used right up to the beginning of the Port Authority. And then there were the big buses in urban service, which came in principally to replace streetcars, as many routes were converted between 1950 and the takeover by the authority. And this is Pittsburgh Railway's streetcar and bus in 1955. Streetcars are the black lines, the blue and red are buses. So the Port Authority was created in 1956, but had nothing to do with transit. It was created to manage improvements to freight handling facilities on the rivers. But in 1959, in view of the decline of transit, it was given power to operate countywide public transit system. And then for the next 5 years, it was busy planning and then purchasing 33 private bus companies plus Pittsburgh Railways, and bring plans to rationalize the system so it was a truly united system over the whole area. And it began operation on March 1, 1964. I want to mention that the Port Authority was not necessarily a popular public conception. A lot of people, and this flyer is typical of it, fought against the establishment of mass transit operated by a governmental agency. All kinds of silly things were said, and I like the one at the bottom most. Money is wasted when it is spent against the wishes of the people. They want to drive their cars. They don't want to ride public transit. Money then should be spent to build access routes to accommodate cars. Wonderful. So the mission of the authority was to basically grow ridership, improve service, and make a 20th late 20th century transit system. And it had to integrate the operators, upgrade all the vehicles. The plan from day one was to replace all streetcars and so on and so forth. And one thing they were also told to develop and implement rapid transit service, whatever that meant. So there on the left is a list of the private companies that went into the authority, not including Pittsburgh Railways. And on the right is what the system looked like. Actually, this is a 1976 map, but you can see it goes way beyond the city and attempts to serve every area of Allegheny County. Some of the lines actually went to neighboring counties. And this is what Pittsburgh or the Port Authority took over, a hodgepodge of buses and streetcars, many of the buses dating back to before World War II. I will say that the bus at the bottom left, not the Streamliner, but the one next to it en route salt spreader, that was a bus converted for the sole purpose of spreading salt on the street. One of the first things the authority did was to unify the fare structure and create a radial system. Very complicated and hard to understand from my recollection. Everybody understands how a radial fare structure works, but what happens when you're trying to go between segments on the outer ends? Now I bring you up to date on what happened after the creation of the Port Authority in 1964. You previously saw the half to the left of the 1964 line. Well, things didn't go better in terms of population. The city continued to decline till about 2010, and it's stabilized since then at about 330,000. The population in the county outside of Pittsburgh has stayed the same, but when you include Pittsburgh in the total, the net effect is to cause a significant 20% decline in population, even in the entire county, city, and suburbs. So the ridership base is potentially ridership base, doesn't grow. And you can see what happened over on the right. From 1964, the Port Authority came in. The reason the green line is a little bit above the Pittsburgh Railways line in the red is it added in the 10 million or so passengers picked up from the independent carriers. The Port Authority did a pretty good job in the first few years of stabilizing the ridership, and then around the middle 70s actually grew the ridership considerably, getting back above 100 million riders for the first time in quite a while. Unfortunately, around 1980, it ran up against funding constraints that caused retractions in service, with consequent decline of ridership, which lasted all the way up to 1990. It stabilized then and stayed the same at about 60 million a year up till the pandemic, when it, like everybody else, it took a terrible nosedive. Presently, the ridership is about 40 million, a far cry from the 280 million of 1948. Just wanted to show you something here. Population density is a significant factor in transit, as I'm sure all of you know. In 1950, Pittsburgh City had a density of 4,700 per square kilometer. Today, that's 2,100 per square kilometer. Now, you compare that 2,100 to 2020 statistics for the European cities and American cities on the bottom. It's a very low density, and frankly, it's a wonder that we still have the system in Pittsburgh that we do, bus and rail. So on day one of the Port Authority, this was a streetcar system operating in Pittsburgh. A lot of lines had been abandoned during the Pittsburgh Railway's last 8 years, mostly for bridge replacement or road improvement. Pittsburgh Railways fought against abandonment of streetcar lines, but was basically forced into it because of the huge amount of money that would have been needed to incorporate streetcars in road projects. So on day one, the Port Authority looked just like Pittsburgh Railways, and it would for several years. The only difference was the sticker I illustrate on the bottom here was stuck on every single vehicle, the private companies and Pittsburgh Railways. Every vehicle, every truck, every streetcar, every bus all had a nice white sticker. Even an ancient snow sweeper over on the right got a sticker. And the Port Authority didn't want anyone to think that the Pittsburgh Railways Company was still in business. So they sent crews out to the car houses and ground off the word company from the sign up above the windows. This is what the Port Authority wanted. As it says, their policy was to replace streetcars with buses. And they were pretty intent on carrying that out with all due speed. They ordered 150 buses even before taking operation over in March. And they came in and the streetcars came off. So we'll go by year and you can see what the impact was. A little bit in 1964, the summer of 64, the lines in red were changed to bus. The next year, half the north side and some east, out by East Pittsburgh and Homestead were also bus. The rest of the north side went in 66 and assorted lines in other parts of the city. Next year, 67 was the big hammer. The entire East End, 9 lines, was converted in January of 67. And after that, all that was left was in the South Hills, and things weren't even stable there. 68, several lines were converted. And in 71, the last abandonment was the Carrick line. After that, the system stayed the same for about 12, 15 years. This is what it looked like. That caricature is Pat Polite. Kind of had a decal of Pat Polite on the bus, but in the official version, he's smiling. So what did Pittsburgh Railways Port Authority look like in the mid-60s? Still looked very much like a streetcar town. It's coming off the Smithfield Street Bridge on the Smithfield Street. The Port Authority did come up with a new paint scheme. It was felt that you couldn't really paint a streetcar in silver, so a gray version of what the bus paint scheme was appeared on a number of cars. The Port Authority paint scheme. Liberty Street in downtown. Over on the north side, it's called the Mexican War District. These houses date back to about 1840. The 1790 was a General Electric PCC. This is just before the north side closed, and all the 1700s above 1775 to 99 were taken out of service. Pittsburgh bought mostly Westinghouse equipped cars. Out of every 100, 75 were Westinghouse and 25 were General Electric. And they just did to stay in the good graces of the two major suppliers. Lots of private right-of-way up on the north side. And some very pleasant street running through the outer suburbs. So on the 614, one of the very last lines, this type of arrangement here, the double track went to single to go around sharp curves. Wasn't room for 2 tracks. So you see up on the pole to the left of the car, the Nashod signal, which worked off the trolley wire contactors and gave the car authority to take the single track. One of the very last line on the north side was the 21 Fine View. It's well known in Pittsburgh for its very different type of operation, of single track it ran in a loop, and the outbound section of the route was quite scenic and was about 500 feet higher than the terminal downtown. Taken the last day on the north side in April of 1966, the highest numbered and last to be delivered Pittsburgh PCC car. Shortly after the streetcars were taken off the north side, they got serious about the bridges. Pittsburgh Railways actually owned bridges like this. They had been built for streetcars, and car traffic was added later. They were extremely unpopular with drivers. And in this case, you have a very long one-lane road because the bridges were in danger of collapse. You're not getting that message on your screen, are you? Low system resources. Anyway, moving to the east side, the Port Authority ran on some of the newest track in Pittsburgh on Bedford Avenue, Center Avenue and Bedford Avenue, past the Civic Arena, Civic Auditorium. This was a landmark building in Pittsburgh in the early 60s, which could be almost fully opened. It no longer exists. Much more common Pittsburgh scene is here on the Frankstown route. This is generally what the cars look like in the middle 60s. Some very, very nice photographic opportunities in Pittsburgh. These are all my slides, by the way. Pittsburgh did not have what we here call a Grand Union, which is two double track lines crossing and able to move from one route to any other route. Went through some very nice neighborhoods. This is just note here, this was the last track project carried out by Pittsburgh Railways. The city wanted to rebuild Fifth Avenue. The authority was responsible, Pittsburgh Railways was responsible for doing the middle where the track was. So they put in new track, paved it in asphalt, and created flangeways by dragging a work car up and down the asphalt. There was no guardrail, no T-rail, no girder rail. And as soon as it was done, the pressure of tires on the edge, unprotected edge of the flangeway just caused the whole thing to fall apart. And the street ended up being in worse condition than it was before it was fixed. An interesting part of this is East Liberty, which was the major business section outside of downtown. Many streetcar lines came through here, had some interesting track work in this area. Taken on the last day of service in the East End. Now this car has just crossed over a bridge, which you can't see in the far distance, but we'll have another picture of a bridge at that location later. This is the high speed, or maybe it was once upon a time, 87 Ardmore, which ran out to East Pittsburgh. Had signals to space cars, but by this time, there were so few cars running on the line that you never encountered a second car. This is possibly the first car repainted by the Port Authority into the Port Authority paint scheme. This is on Ardmore Boulevard, and the car had just come out of the shop. Downtown East Pittsburgh. It's my father's 64 Ford sitting there. Over in Braddock, which was not far from East Pittsburgh, was the Rankin Car House. And that's the building on the right. When the authority was created, it bought 283 cars from Pittsburgh Railways. Took a long time. There was a big court fight, but it took several years, but they did take 283 cars. But Pittsburgh Railways actually had about 100 more cars, which the authority did not take, refused to take. And most of those cars were stored inside this car barn for years and eventually scrapped right in the car barn. And here in Braddock is another one of those going to go around a curve. So we go back to single track. The last day of regular service in the East End was actually January 27th, because Saturday and Sunday, they were already running buses on weekends. But on Sunday, the borough of Wilkinsburg chartered a car and it ran around Wilkinsburg, where I lived, all day long, giving free rides. And it was the only car operating that day in the East End. And once it passed over on its last trip, no car ever ran on these tracks again. There was one line or one track, it really wasn't a route, that held on for a year on the East End. In order to get to the Homewood shops, which were in the East End, one route was retained with trolley wire. And from time to time, cars were hauled over to Homewood shops, either to be get work there or be stripped for parts. And that car pulling it is M200, which was locally known as the tow car. Now we're on the south side. We're looking south at the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie station, where that car is jogging into this trackage in the far distance. To the right of the bridge, Silver Bridge truss, is the entrance to the South Hills Tunnel, which probably in retrospect is the sole reason that there are still light rail running in Pittsburgh. It was a trolley only tunnel that ran through Mount Washington, which is that hill, and went on to cars could then go on a variety of lines, some of which had extensive private right-of-way, and that private right-of-way saved this operation. This is in the south side, which today is a booming, very trendy neighborhood. A lot of neighborhoods in Pittsburgh had declined terribly in the 50s and 60s, but this one came back big time in the 80s. Only one route came to the South Hills by going up, two routes by going up a hill, and that was the main one, was the 53 Carrick. Here it's ascended from the Smithfield Street Bridge up to Arlington Avenue, a climb of about 400 feet. And it's going to go across one of the lines that came through the tunnel with a 48 Arlington. I wanted to point out, between the two cars on a pole, you see a funny looking signal. This signal, this traffic intersection had no traffic signals. It was a very busy intersection, but because most of the traffic was streetcars, there were no traffic signals. Instead, there was a traffic policeman, which are pretty rare today, stationed at the intersection. And that signal counted how many cars had come in at the other end of the tunnel. And up to 6 cars, if he knew where they were coming, he knew he had to create a path for the streetcars to get across. This is the south portal, the north portal of the tunnel itself. Now, just to the left, you can just see a little slice of yellow next to the pole, right at the edge of the frame. That was a public street that came down a very steep hill, and the cars made a left turn and followed the streetcar track out to Carson Street. This is probably the most dangerous arrangement you can imagine in terms of streetcars and cars colliding. The other end of the tunnel at South Hills Junction. This is South Hills Car House early in the Port Authority era. The cars on the ramp going up the hill, that's the former 40 Mount Washington car line, but after it had been closed in 1966. And this was probably taken in the late spring of 1967. And the cars you see there are all out of service. Once the East End closed, there was a terrific surplus of cars. And those cars from the East End mostly never ran again. The 40 was a short route, and it went from downtown across the bridge through the tunnel and then up a hill to get back on top of Mount Washington. Had some very interesting street running. Ended up here above the river, which is it had just crossed on the Smithfield Street Bridge. Further down in the South Hills Tunnel Trolley car house yard. This is the Palm Garden Trestle, which carried the Mount Lebanon, Brookline cars and Dormont across a bridge over the Sawmill Run Valley. It's called Palm Garden because those buildings up above on the car before they were there was a dance hall called Palm Garden. The 4238, which was a combination of the former 42 and former 38, climbed the hill up towards Beachview. I used this picture for a Christmas card in 1972. A little bit further on, it went over a trestle, and light rail still operates here today. Passed through Dormont, and and came into Mount Lebanon on the street. Now, light rail still runs here today, but in a tunnel. The interurban from South Hills Junction followed Sawmill Run, but up the side of a very steep hill. Those are the Liberty Tunnels built in 1928, which made it possible to easily drive to downtown from the South Hills. This is on the same line, a little bit further along to the south. I had much single track up there. I always like this slide. It shows a car on the Overbrook line about 2 miles from downtown Pittsburgh, and it looks like it could have been taken way out in the country. Same area. This was originally a steam railroad here, which when I get to a third program, I'll have information on how that came to be. And here we have a car going out to Drake, having just left Washington Junction. It's heading up the hill on single track. Those houses in the background are built on top of a refuse dump for a coal mine. Let's talk about rapid transit. Way back as far as 1900, there had been proposals for rapid transit in Pittsburgh, subway, elevated, whatever. Nothing ever really happened. In the 50s, the Port Authority was created, and when it got its transit mandate in 1959, it included study of rapid transit. At about the same time, Westinghouse Electric, which you're probably familiar with, was a huge presence in Pittsburgh. It was home base for Westinghouse Electric, Westinghouse Air Brake, and Union Switch and Signal, all founded by George Westinghouse, but all separate companies. Westinghouse Electric got interested in automated guideway transit. It wasn't even called that then, and it just didn't really exist at that point. So they created a system which came to be known as Skybus. And they arranged with the government to build a demonstration line of their concept in South Park, a public park south of downtown. Meanwhile, the Port Authority, after much consideration, created the Early Action Program, which included AGT for an eventual 60-mile system and 2 busways. Unfortunately, AGT was Star Wars on steroids for a lot of people. And there was great concern about whether it was even feasible to employ such a technology. Today, we take it for granted. It's all over the place. But back then, it took a leap of faith to think it could be run as public transit. Nevertheless, the Port Authority decided it was going to include Skybus. A wave of opposition, mostly from political people, including the mayor of Pittsburgh, eventually resulted in the AGT concept being thrown out the window, and it was replaced with light rail. And as a result, we have the light rail system that operates today. But it took quite a few years, like from 1969 to 1976, to work through the problem. And everything kind of, as far as the streetcar system, was stalled during that delay. This is just a shot of a 1917 plan for subways in Pittsburgh, and it also included elevated. Never happened. And this never happened either, but it looked good on paper. This came out about the time Skybus was being proposed, but nobody, or certainly whoever created this illustration, had no idea what it would actually look like. So this is pure fantasy, but it was something new and it attracted attention. What actually did happen was what was called the Transit Expressway. It was originally known as Skybus, but it turned out that somebody else, an airline, I think, had a copyright on the term Skybus. So they changed it to Transit Expressway, and the Port Authority further added Transit Expressway Revenue Line to the name, and that's what this was called. Basically consists of small cars running on a guideway with computer control. Nothing unusual by today's standards, but a big deal then. This is on the demonstration line. Vehicle had 8 rubber tires, two pairs front and back, and 2 motors, picked up from a equivalent of a third rail, as were the commands from the computer. The guidance was a central beam with horizontal wheels to hold it in place on either side. This is what the guideway looked like on the demonstration line, and a rather optimistic view of a median expressway application. You notice there's something missing here that you could not get by with today. There's absolutely zero provision for emergency egress from the vehicle, other than a bucket truck, I guess. Anyway, a 2-mile guideway was produced and operated on and off, mostly for research for Westinghouse, for about 6 years. It survived the decision not to use Skybus and was in place but not operated for many years into the 1980s. Its most public use was for the Allegheny County Fair, where for a dime, 10 cents, people would line up and get on and ride around the loop. Also, you notice that there's no provision at that station for elevators. That would not fly today. This is the only picture I ever took of Skybus. And if you look very closely, they only had doors on one side of the car. And apparently the sensitive edge must not have been working on the car, because you can see a couple hands protruding from between the edges of the door. Nevertheless, it was included in the early action program for the Port Authority, which was the Transit Expressway line, basically to replace the 4238 streetcar and 2 busways. And this is a map of the proposal. Now you'll notice that the Transit Expressway line goes through a tunnel and over a bridge into downtown Pittsburgh. As it happens, that's not the streetcar tunnel. The streetcar tunnel is marked by the purple line. So they needed a tunnel and a bridge. Unfortunately, there was no bridge, but there was a tunnel. And that's how it was going to run. We'll talk about the tunnel in just a second. Inconveniently, while this fight over mode was going on between the politicians and the public and the media, the Westinghouse Air Brake Company, another Westinghouse company, jumped forward with its own proposal for rapid transit in Pittsburgh. And its route was similar to early action, but this was all steel wheel, steel rail, including the line out to Wilkinsburg, which follows the same route as the proposed busway. That happens to be alongside the main line of the Pennsylvania Railroad. That, in fact, was built as a busway in the end. Anyway, Westinghouse, the Port Authority did not really want to hear about a Westinghouse air brake proposal. They wanted to get on with Skybus. And this led to a lot of trouble. They didn't even allow the public to see presentation of the Skybus plan. I will say that Westinghouse air brakes plan was supposed to cost $110 million, whereas Skybus and Busway was priced at $220 million. I can't explain the difference because the entire streetcar system would have been grade separated under the Westinghouse air brake plan, which would have cost a fortune. Where'd the tunnel come from? A little bit of history. Back around 1900, a guy named George Gould owned several railroads, the Denver and Rio Grande, the Missouri Pacific, and the Wabash, and the Wheeling and Lake Erie, and the Western Maryland. He wanted, as did his father before him, to build and own a coast-to-coast railroad in the United States. Never has been. Maybe someday there'll be one, but not now and not then. So he arranged to have the Western Pacific put under construction out west, and to close the gap between Wheeling, Ohio, and Cumberland, Maryland. That it meant getting to Pittsburgh, where he hoped to capitalize on the huge amount of industrial traffic generated in Pittsburgh at the steel mills. The tunnel he had to build to get into Pittsburgh went under Mount Washington, just like the streetcar tunnel. Then the train soared over the Monongahela River on a gigantic cantilever bridge into the station. The station is just off to the left at the bottom, and on the right is a picture of the station, probably the nicest looking station built in Pittsburgh. It opened about 1904, and for a brief time, there were trains all the way to St. Louis. But the expected traffic, industrial traffic, never materialized. Andrew Carnegie, who is the kingpin of the steel industry, he initially had supported the Wabash Pittsburgh terminal because he wanted an alternative to the stranglehold the Pennsylvania and Baltimore and Ohio had on his businesses. But he reached a truce with them, and all the potential business for the Gould system just evaporated. So the railroad only lasted until 1931, as far as its entry into Pittsburgh was concerned, 1932 for passenger service, and then for freight, 1946. When the freight house burned down, the bridge was torn down, and the tunnel was sealed up. And here you see the tunnel gone, tunnel sealed up, and the bridge piers, the only thing left from the bridge. But it was thought that Skybus could easily come across through that tunnel and cross on a new bridge built on top of the old piers. Well, this proved to be pretty fanciful and never happened, to make a long story short. But the Port Authority nevertheless did rebuild the tunnel. So on your right, you can see the tunnel is reconfigured for Skybus. There's 4 parallel concrete beams, which would be the running surface for Skybus. And about $9 million was spent rebuilding the tunnel. Once it was clear no bridge was going to be built, the plan became tunnel to immediately outside the tunnel on the north end, make a hard right turn, run along the Pennsylvania Railroad, above the Smithfield Street Bridge, cross the river on the Panhandle Railroad Bridge, and then go on an existing railroad line over to Penn Station, which was the Pittsburgh station of the Pennsylvania Railroad. But then Skybus got thrown out, as we talked about earlier. And what happened after that was the tunnel portal, which had been reconfigured to accommodate air handling machinery, was sealed up once again. The southern portal was sealed, but then it was unsealed. The Port Authority decided it would back buses in on that guideway to store them. And 80 buses were held in there for a couple years. Unfortunately, the vandals gained access, destroyed every window in every bus. And on top of that, the environment inside the tunnel was very nasty, and that created all sorts of metal decay problems and so on the buses. They just went to scrap. 10 years later, somebody decided it would be nice to have a high occupancy vehicle lane in the tunnel, and it was in fact built. It's been open about 20 years now, and it comes down on the Pittsburgh side, the north side, on this ramp down to Carson Street. Probably somewhat similar to what the Skybus would have done to get onto this railroad right away. The problem with the high occupancy vehicle is that the drivers don't like it. So it only carries about 500 vehicles a day, which is nothing. And this is the Panhandle Bridge, which we'll talk about more. This is the bridge that the Skybus would have run over and which light rail does run over today. It's a railroad bridge built about 1904. Just want to mention, how did that bridge come available to the Port Authority? In the 1920s, on the left, passenger traffic on the Pennsylvania and is illustrated. There were hundreds and hundreds of passenger trains running through Pittsburgh. And many of them went over the Panhandle Bridge en route to St. Louis and Wheeling and Cincinnati and so on. The freight traffic wasn't a factor. If you look at the circle on the right diagram, you see there's just a very thin line. Freight was kept out of downtown Pittsburgh, except for freight originating or terminating in the downtown area. Pennsylvania had built many bypasses so that freight could be routed around the city. As I say, then Skybus fell by the wayside. Eventually, it was demolished. One Skybus was found in a garage by Bombardier, which succeeded Westinghouse and AdTrans, and it was restored and put at the plant in West Mifflin, PA, and it's still there as far as I know. The plant itself didn't end up building rapid transit cars for Skybus, but is used in the transit industry today, and it will provide the electrical gear and so on for the SEPTA order of new light rail cars that will be built in the next couple of years. Back to the tunnel. By then, the Port Authority had realized that streetcars were going to be around for a while, but it still wanted to have a busway to the south side, South Hills. So work began to convert the tunnel to handle buses. This was a long project, and during it, directional running was in place on the line. Inbound cars used the tunnel and came over the hill to go outbound, and vice versa in the afternoon. Took a long time to rebuild the tunnel with new tracks, concrete pavement, new lighting, ventilation, so on and so forth. But eventually it was done, and this was the result. It essentially looks like this today. It's really tight quarters in there for opposing vehicles to pass. But the buses started running through the tunnel in 1975. First on the busway to halfway down the Overbrook line, which went on its own right of way for about half the distance, and then back onto the streetcar paved right of way for the last mile or two. Interestingly, this arrangement of shared operation was discontinued when the line was rebuilt around year 2000. It had lots of problems between buses and streetcars. So knowing that streetcars were going to be around for a while, the Port Authority realized that it better get some in better condition than they were. And so they went through what they called a facelifting process. It was not a full rebuilding, but it did significantly improve the cars. Here's a line out on Drake. This part of the line no longer exists. Signals like this, including they were put in 1928 on Pittsburgh Railway's interurban lines, and a number of them are still in use today. Then came the need to improve the physical appearance of the fleet. That is, if you think it needs to be improved. Harold Geisenheimer was general manager in the early 1970s, and he engaged a public relations firm to design a new paint scheme. And it was pretty bright. It could be any colors you wanted. And stuff started appearing in all sorts of colors. The theory was that eventually you could put advertising in the white section. And they did. Here's the full effect. The car labeled trolley is the most extreme example. But needless to say, it suddenly made Pittsburgh the most colorful streetcar operation in North America. After the busway started running in 1977, this is one of the biggest accidents in the Port Authority history. This car was preparing to turn left while a bus was approaching from the other direction. And let me take that back. The car was not supposed, it was supposed to turn left, but the operator did not throw the switch. Nevertheless, the switch position changed and he didn't stop, and he swung to the left anyway, and a few people ended up being killed in this. This started to question whether or not they wanted to continue running PCC cars. Nevertheless, they did keep running them. Some were rebuilt somewhat. I'm just showing a few pictures of cars. Several were turned into double end cars. This is one that became a double end car. Trolley pole was added on the front, and a backup controller was put in under the back seat. Pittsburgh had not previously ever had a double end PCC car. Now, the 1779 didn't stay in this condition very long. It had an accident and was rebuilt with what was called the extra special trolley treatment. And the shop fabricated a new end, which somewhat resembled a more modern light rail car. It actually was easier to put the front end on an existing car than try to replicate the compound curves of a PCC front end. And there was another one. It came in all sorts of colors. This is an interesting car. Somebody had the idea of creating a car for a three-way tourist attraction, a ride on the Gateway Clipper, the old Monongahela Incline, and on a streetcar. So this is a attempt to make a streetcar look like a steamboat. The problem with this arrangement was that the car could not go through the Mount Washington Tunnel due to clearance issues. It nevertheless tried to go through once with the unsatisfactory results. This is Smithfield Street Bridge, the oldest bridge in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh, by the way, has 450 or so bridges, more than any other city in the world, including Venice. This bridge was built in 1883 and later expanded and has had rails on it since day one. Typical street running in Pittsburgh with the Belgian block and girder rail. We earlier saw a picture of a car with snow on the houses taken on this bridge. Same bridge. This was a poor day for a fan trip, but it was a fan trip nevertheless. This is the line car, which was used for work on the overhead catenary. This car survives today at the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum, is used quite frequently. Another car is still with us, is the M517, which was used to spray weeds on private right-of-way. In Dormont, you can still ride on a car here, but the hill in the background has disappeared and is now the entry into the subway. The very last car, 1600 car, rebuilt into 1700. First car with a pantograph. This appeared out in Castle Shannon on the training loop in 1979. And thereafter, all the remaining cars had pantographs installed, generally in the front, but eventually in the back. Smithfield Street Bridge. As time went on, even further, they knew that this rehabilitation any cars had had before was not going to keep them running long enough to build the subway and get enough new cars to replace PCCs. So the idea hatched of rebuilding 45 cars in the Port Authority shops. And these cars were to undergo a very substantial rebuild, basically using a few parts from an existing car and fabricating everything else new. And new running gear, new motors, basically a new PCC car. A total of 12 new cars were built, and the project was stopped because the cost was coming in 3 times what had been estimated. Here's the first one to be completed. You can't see it in this picture, but it has rivets on the side, unlike any production PCC from St. Louis Car or Pullman Standard. It used a composite on the sides instead of metal panels, and they needed rivets to hold it all together. This portion of the line in Castle Shannon still operates today. Cars downtown ran on 2 loops around city blocks until 1985. Now here we have a car running with the pantograph up, but before the line was reconstructed for light rail. So the rebuilding program was broken into 2 stages. Stage 1 was the line in red and the downtown subway. This left alone the Overbrook line, which is in black, and the outer end of the Drake line. on the diagram on the left. On the right is the downtown subway. Previously, cars would have come straight out of the tunnel and crossed the Smithfield Street Bridge and then had street running through downtown. This one would bring cars across the Panhandle Bridge into a subway to the Midtown Station where the lines would split. A branch, in effect, would continue on to Penn Plaza Station. Notice it goes a single track in the middle. And the main line would go on a cut and cover subway down 6th Avenue and then under Liberty Avenue to a loop underground at Gateway Plaza. Work got underway on this subway in around 1981. Here it is depicted from above. And again, another line that shows crossing the Panhandle Bridge. And in the red is the subway portion and the yellow is above ground. Notice the star there in the middle of the picture. A very historic event occurred there a long time before this. And I'll mention it in a minute. Well, I'll mention it right now. When George Westinghouse, his first company was the Westinghouse Air Brake Company. It was formed after he had created an air brake. Now, the vacuum brake, which I'm sure many of you from the UK are familiar with, came just a little bit later. But the air brake he invented was the first mechanized means for stopping a train other than cranking a wheel with a wood club to tighten up the tread brakes. In September of 1868, the first test was being made through the tunnel that today is occupied by a light rail line. And a train came out of the tunnel and found a horse-drawn wagon occupying the track. And the engineer applied the brakes fully, and the engine stopped in a whole lot faster than it could have stopped with a handbrake. And that's considered the first successful use of an air brake on a railroad. Now, whether that's actually true, I don't know, but that's what is said. Anyway, remember I showed you Midtown Plaza Station, which is today called Steel Plaza. It's where that circle is, the red circle. And the building is the United States Steel Building, which was built in the middle half of the 1960s, tallest building in Pittsburgh. When it was built, it was necessary to excavate away a huge pit in order to get deep foundations for that building. In the process, it cut through the railroad tunnel, which you see is the larger of the two tunnels in the view here. And the other tunnel is actually a little bit more interesting. In the 1840s, a canal and railroad were built from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. And when it got to Pittsburgh, it was a canal, and it came across an aqueduct into a terminal in downtown, and then passed through a tunnel under Grants Hill and to an outlet onto the Monongahela River. And that tunnel is what was uncovered when the U.S. Steel Building was constructed. Here's Steel Plaza under construction, quite a project. And another view of the same thing. That is the Henry Hobson Richardson, noted American architect, county jail in the walled compound. The end station ended up looking quite nice. It's a 4-track station, but the Penn Plaza service no longer operates. Cut and cover downtown, very popular. The interesting thing was, because PCCs were going to be running in the subway and they were single end, a loop was constructed underground in a big, happened to be open space at Gateway Center. There was no inbound platform. Instead, cars came around the loop and stopped at the platform on the outbound track. and people got off and people got on at the same platform. It's also said that it was put in because an engineer felt that a stub-ended station would be unable to handle the volume of streetcar traffic coming into this terminal. And that's what the original loop looked like. Of course, rebuilding for stage one involved a lot of much less extensive work, including tearing up all the track that ran in the streets in Beachview. And it was a humongous project. At South Hills Junction, which is just outside the South Hills Trolley Tunnel, the administration building is this pile of rubble in the middle, that was being torn down to accommodate the new track plan. You can see a car disappearing up onto the Overbrook line, and then the other line was down past the cement mixer. The other lines out of here to Mount Washington and to the Arlington route were already closed. Here's the track plan installed. In contemporary light rail, at least in the United States, there is an aversion to having anything other than track work from the catalog. And so in order to fit everything in, the whole thing had to be reconfigured. That required eliminating this grade going up here with another slightly less severe grade going up, which would then be tied in up here. That led to some interesting future complications, but we'll talk about those in a minute. This is what South Hills Junction looks like today from the air. At the other end of the proposed route at South Hills Village, a totally new operations and maintenance center was built. The last station coming from Pittsburgh is here on the extreme right, and then there's some non-revenue track. It leads up into the complex. This is, oh, wait a minute. One PCC car that was preserved by the Port Authority is this car, which is Plinth at South Hills Village yard here, and you can see it. It's right here behind this fir tree directly above the car. Inside looks pretty much like standard light rail facility. For several years, it was necessary to run both PCC cars and light rail cars. Light rail cars were built by Siemens. It's a, I'm trying to think of it. I think it's a U3 car, basically. Not really sure about that. Here's a car descending through South Hills Village Station, or ascending. He's going up the hill towards the car barn. And later on this new track, he comes down to meet the Drake line. But by this time, the 1600s were all surplus, and they were all what was left of them. It's numbered 17, but it's really a 1600. They were scrapped. Meanwhile, a car came out of the South Hills Tunnel onto Carson Street without any brakes. And it left the track and crashed into a Pittsburgh and Lake Erie station building. This is like deja vu all over again, because back in 1917, virtually the same thing in the same place happened on Christmas Eve. A car lost its pole in the tunnel. It was so crowded that the operator or conductor could not get off the car. This is on Christmas Eve, 1917. And the pole was replaced by the following car. And the car that had lost its pole then careened down the tunnel out of control and left the rails and struck a trolley wire support pole, which basically sliced through the middle of the car and ended up with 24 people dead. This time, nobody was killed. PCCs did run into the subway, which opened in May of 1985. Obviously, Pittsburgh has a high platform subway, but since PCCs were going to run into it, each platform in the subway had a short length of low platform, so the PCCs could service the low platforms. A view on 6th Avenue underground, pretty standard stuff. For the opening of the subway, car 3756 was brought back from the Trolley Museum, Pennsylvania Trolley Museum, and a pantograph was mounted on the roof by the Port Authority, and it ran on various trips celebrating the opening of the subway. It did not itself go into the subway, I don't believe. Winding up production of the 12 rebuilt PCCs, by then they were in the new paint scheme, and the pantograph had been moved to the back. This was on a private fan trip in 1989. Some cars had wings around the headlights, some cars did not. And also a difference from the previous PCCs was the car did not have a full width anti-climber. But these cars were very effective in doing what they were supposed to do. Many of them have been preserved in one way or another, but not all. Here we're at First Avenue Station, which is an add-on station that opened after the subway was open. Let's see if I can, it's not built yet in this view, but there is a station here today. And behind is the Panhandle Bridge, and in the shadow is the ramp down to Station Square and the entrance to the subway, to the Mount Washington Tunnel. And here is a ramp up to Arlington Avenue, and it's possible to go up to the top of Arlington and then down to the south portal of the Mount Washington Tunnel. Station Square during a test phase, at which time the cars weren't even outwardly numbered. Same, you notice the streetcars are still running on the old track into downtown in the background. Later, this had to be connected to the existing line. This is the arrangement for the doors. So Pittsburgh did not want lifts or anything complicated. So each car has, articulated car has one low level door at either end. And thus it can serve both those stops in the subway, which are no longer used, the low level platforms, but out in the outer ends of the existing two light rail lines, there are many low volume stops which have low platforms. And so they are still used. The problem is you can only get on or off at one end of the car. And if two cars are coupled, you have to know that you have to be in the first car, because the doors, the low level doors, will not open at any platform other than a high platform. That leads to some problems sometimes, people getting trapped on the car, so to speak. This is after the pavement was put in so a car can enter from Station Square into the trolley tunnel. Pretty tight curve here. And passing through South Hills Junction. Now, originally the tracks were over on the left, but when this was rebuilt, they had to be moved. Now we're going out on the old 4238, now the 42, or actually, currently it's the red line. This is in Beachview. When it gets to Dormont, it goes into a tunnel. Previously, it went up a grade here and then onto the street and past that church you see in the background. But part of the plan involved tunneling under downtown Mount Lebanon to get out of the traffic and also free up the street for automobiles. Out on the far end of the Drake line, which this particular part is beyond where the maintenance facility is and is currently out of service. The wire's been removed for a number of years. The track is still there. And then came September of 1999, the very last day. By the time this picture was taken, PCCs were only being used to run a very short shuttle between Drake and Washington Junction. It took basically one PCC to run that, but they did have 4 available. On the last day, which is this day here, this is actually after the last day on a fan trip, they could muster 3 cars to run. All of these cars found homes elsewhere, I believe. The 4004 is at the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum. And this is the First Avenue station, which was built about 2000. It fills in a gap in coverage in the downtown area. Then we have Stage 2. Stage 2 is the Overbrook line in yellow, and the remainder of the the library line shown here in red, as well as the Drake line. But the Drake line was never done, so that's the part that's now been abandoned. So it took a long time to get to Stage 2. The subway opened in 1985. The PCCs continued to run on the library line until 1993, when it was determined that bridges on the Overbrook line up on the single track section were unsafe, and it was shut down in 1993. Thereafter, cars ran out to library, had to come through Mount Lebanon. The Overbrook line stayed shut down until reconstruction began about 2000, and it was reopened in 2004. Just a reminder, this is the Overbrook line, and up on the left, the red box shows the section at risk in terms of bridges. It's right alongside of the hill, and there were several high bridges that were in shaky shape. Here's a few pictures along it. One day in 1965, I got off a car up there and walked the line. Not over the bridges, though. Now we're back in South Hills Junction. The new line has been opened. The subway's been opened. We have a new South Hills Junction station. And over here, there is call it a station, but it was a new structure, but not expected to be permanent. And the cars came up here on the new alignment, which was formerly over here, and got onto the Overbrook line. Notice that it's on a grade here, pretty substantial grade. And here's another view at the same place. Light rail cars were able to come up to the top of that grade right here and could change ends and then go back into the city. It was used pretty rarely, I would think, but it's the only convenient place where they could be turned around, changed ends anyway. Well, what happened was time came to rebuild the Overbrook line. That last picture was taken by the X. It was determined that it was necessary to abandon this section of track because a station could not be built down where that temporary station was. And the reason was that while the new South Hills Junction station has a grade as well, this one was more severe. But more importantly, the Americans with Disabilities Act had been fully enacted by the time it came to rebuild this line. And it was not permissible to have a station with more than a 2% grade in the platform. This would have been way over 2%. And there was no real way that that could have been avoided because it had to climb up here one way or another. So basically this line was cut right here by this bridge over the road. And in its place, 2 flyover ramps were constructed over into the left by the silver buildings. And to show how far out of touch I was with Pittsburgh, I only recently discovered that these flyovers were constructed. So this is taken from the red line going down towards the Palm Garden. And these are the flyovers. It's the inbound and the outbounds on the right. As to the former single track line, it was very heavily rebuilt, double track for its entire length, and new retaining walls, very extensive grading, and so on in order to make this work with a minimum of curvature and far enough away from the hill that the sliding of the hill would not be a problem. One of the 2 new stations on this section. So let's go for a ride. Oh, first I have to tell you about this. The big extension to the light rail system since it was constructed was a line from the former Gateway Center station in the downtown to the North Shore, which anybody from Pittsburgh in my era still calls the North Side. But anyway, it was constructed a new station to begin with at Gateway Center, a tunnel under the river, which came underground to the first station, which is North Shore, and then rises up to an elevated structure to the final station, which is Allegheny, it's called. This is the new version of the station at Gateway Center Plaza. This was quite a project here. You'll remember the loop that we saw earlier had to be abandoned, and a new station constructed in conjunction with a tunnel making a hard turn to the north in preparation for going under the street to the river and underground. Oh, it's underground now here too, of course. This was a big project. Passes 80 feet below the river in 2 separate parallel tubes. Reaches the North Shore station and then rises up to the terminal station at Allegheny. Here he is just coming into the terminal station. And here is the station and where the bumping blocks are. Theoretically, this line could be extended. Talk has occurred of extending it to the airport, which is on the other side of the Ohio River, and that would be a multi-billion-dollar project. Remember, we have a line that went through the single track over to Penn Station, the Penn Plaza. This ran till 2007. I had a couple problems. One is it was envisioned as a transfer point to the East Busway. That was an attraction in the design that proved not to be very well used, and there was very light ridership. The other problem was the single track section was there because when the hole was made for the U.S. Steel building, the supports of the building required the one track to be eliminated. As it goes through the excavation there, the line is actually on a bridge underground, surrounded by columns for the U.S. Steel building. And the columns were spaced such that you could not have 2 tracks. So anyway, in 2007, this service was discontinued, and it has only been used since for rare occasions when trains cannot be sent under 6th Avenue over to the North Shore. That happened quite recently when work was being done on that portion, the other portion of the subway. This is the current service arrangement. You have a red line from Allegheny through Beachview and then down to South Hills Village. You have a blue line that goes from the same starting point to the Overbrook line and then to South Hills Village. And then the silver line, which goes all the way down to Library by way of Overbrook. Much of the very little work has been done south of South Hills Junction to Library. It is very, very similar in character to what existed prior to the subway, prior to the Port Authority, in fact. Wood poles hold up single trolley wires. It's kind of nostalgic. You'll see that in a second. So here we'll take a quick ride in the subway. Here we're outbound at Wood Street and under 6th Avenue in downtown. We cross the Panhandle Bridge. Today, there are no railroad tracks here, and the First Avenue station and a giant office building occupy this space. On the far side of the river, you can see the Monongahela Incline, and of course, the Smithfield Street Bridge. The entrance of the tunnel is right over at the bottom of this hill by the red brick building, the tunnel to South Hills Junction. There's a PCC crossing the Panhandle Bridge. A little bit further, trains diverge to the right. Since the pandemic, the operation of two-car trains in Pittsburgh is they run every day, but not too many of them. Usually one car is sufficient. Now we've gone through the tunnel. We're at South Hills Junction Station, and you can see the station is not flat. It is actually, it was built before the full enactment of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So this arrangement was legal at the time of having a grade in the platform that exceeded 2%. It's not legal now. So this station was grandfathered, but if it were to be reconstructed, the new rules would apply. Heading on out through Beachview. When first reconstructed, this had brick pavement in the track area, and it had to be replaced. The effect of these cars weigh 88,000 pounds apiece and deliver quite a pounding to the track and its surrounding pavements. The PCCs only weighed between 38 and 40,000. There's a former single track section between Mount Lebanon and Castle Shannon. Used to be only cars ran on this line single track days during a rush hour. Now it's full time. At Castle Shannon, the red line meets the blue line. This is a blue line train that had come down the Overbrook line. I really paid little attention to Pittsburgh for quite a few years, even though I grew up there. And most of these, I think just about all of these LRV pictures were taken this past summer. Outer end of the South Hills Village line, this is the last station. And you can see this is a low-level station. Now we'll go out to the library end. Note the track has been rebuilt, crossings renewed, but the poles and wires are practically as it was in Pittsburgh Railways days. The only thing is that, wait a minute. I guess I need to push this. Yeah, just a minute. Two things were necessary to allow the light rail cars to run out here. The tracks, the devil strip between the tracks, a space between these two rails in the center, was too narrow for two of these cars to pass. So in a massive, very overnight for a few days operation, one track was pulled away from the other track so that these two types of cars could pass. The other difference is up here it was necessary to insert a fitting between the ear and the wire in order to accommodate pantograph operation with the pantograph not hitting the span wires. I mentioned the signals with the 1928 hardware, and this is one of them. Union Switch and Signal Company, another Westinghouse company at Swissvale, Pennsylvania, back in those days. Now it was later bought by Ansaldo, and frankly, I'm not sure who owns it now. This is a rural area out here. That's a deer. Pennsylvania has a huge deer problem. They were nearly extinct at one time, and now there's thousands upon thousands. And the line ends here at Library, which is the same location as those 3 PCCs on the last day of PCC service. The loop's been removed and a stub terminal now exists. And just one shot here, the line over the hill that does not go through the tunnel, it's used for emergency detours or detours when the tunnel's out of service for whatever reason. This is on that hill. It used to be single track in the PCC days. This coming summer, the tunnel will be restricted to a large degree by tunnel rail replacement, and cars will be running over this hill in both directions for several months. Just a couple of seconds here on expansion possibilities. The problem with expansion is that while we do have rapid transit in the form of the busway, the red line to the east, serving the eastern suburbs as far as Swissvale, most of the people and the heart of the educational cultural area is by this proposed blue line. And at one time, the routes were studied and an alignment was chosen as represented by the red for a light rail line to get east from downtown. How the connections downtown would be handled, which would be in subway, is left for another day. But in any case, you know, it's the old cost is too much situation. What ended up happening is going on as we speak, and that is a busway. And it's one of these busway on an existing street, still got to provide for right turns by auto traffic and so on and so forth. So I guess I'm not overly enthused as this is a solution, but it is what it is. Now we're just going to finish up, believe it or not, by then and now pictures. I like then and now pictures. The criteria for a then and now picture that for me is there has to be a structure in the view in both the then and the now pictures, the same structure. So this is back in the 60s on a line through Beechwood. Same view today. Next we have, I mentioned the single track line. It was a shuttle, it only ran in rush hours. Here it is in the early 70s, mid 70s, 1977. And here it is today. Now we're up by South Hills Junction on Warrington Avenue. Here I can't avoid commenting on the choice of design for the overhead lines. This is probably the worst example I've ever seen of intrusive catenary construction, visually intrusive. Now I turned around when I took the other PCC picture, and we have a car going down to South Hills Junction, crossing over a bridge, which is why there's this hump here, over what was formerly a steam railroad, and coming down into this area here was an incline. I'll talk about that in the next program. But what's in the same building will be this chimney, which is the ventilating tower for the Liberty Tubes auto tunnels. It looks a lot different today. It's out on the Dormont line. It's private right-of-way, but Pittsburgh Railways often in the city would pave over the right-of-way. Not sure exactly why they did that, because it was not to be used by automobiles. And this is the same place today. You saw this picture earlier at South Hills Junction, or at Dorchester, where the new line joins the Drake line. This was taken shortly after this line opened. You can't take this picture today exactly. It's a jungle. And we're up now in Warrington Avenue. The car is preparing to make a right. Well, this car is going to go straight, but it can make a right turn, a left turn, and go down the hill back to Pittsburgh. This was a pretty thriving community then. Today, not so much. Same place, same buildings. Here's a car leaving South Hills Junction on the Overbrook line, and a light rail car in the same place. The Panhandle Bridge in its railroad days. Steam locomotive, diesel days. This picture was taken June 2nd, 1966. And today it looks like this, except there's no PCC. And here's that same train crossing the bridge, and light rail on the bridge today. Things do go wrong from time to time. A freight train on the railroad above derailed, causing cars to crash down onto the Station Square station platforms. A few years ago, led to considerable trouble. That wasn't cleaned up in a day. And then, remember that bridge I pointed out behind the streetcar in the distance? Well, that bridge was replaced, but the replacement recently fell down. The bus was on the bridge at the time the bridge collapsed. Had to be removed. So at last we have Skybus. And that, my friends, is over. This light rail car was wrapped to resemble a Pittsburgh Railway 1700 series car for the Port Authority's 50th anniversary in 2013-14. And we are done. Thank you.